Okay, I'm Dan Barker. So here's my all-time favorite freethinker joke, okay? But you have to imagine that I'm saying it with an Irish accent. I can't do an Irish accent. But anyway, this young teenage boy goes into the confessional in his church and he says, "Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. I committed a horrible sin against God." And the priest said, "What was your sin, my child?" And the boy said, "Well, there's this girl in the parish, and she and I did some things that I'm sure it was a horrible sin against God what we did." And the priest said, "Well, what did you do?" And the boy said, "Oh, I can't tell you what we did, but I know that we crossed the line. I know that she and I, we did some things that were just, I'm sure it was a horrible sin against the holiness of God." And the priest said, "Well, then, who was the young lady?" And the boy said, "Oh, I can't tell you her name. No, I could never tell you her name." And the priest said, "Well, I'm sure it was little Patty O'Connor, wasn't it?" And the boy said, "No, it wasn't Patty O'Connor." "Well, then it must have been little Mary McGuire. Wasn't it Mary McGuire?" "No, it wasn't Mary McGuire." "Well, then it must have been little Sandra O'Brien." "That's who it was. It was Sandra O'Brien, wasn't it?" And the boy said, "No, it wasn't Sandra O'Brien." And the priest said, "Well, if you won't tell me who the young lady was, then you're going to have to do double the penance." So the boy left the church and he met his friend outside, and his friend said, "So what did you get?" And the boy said, "I got 3 great leads." He knew how to work the system. So I'm Dan Barker. I am Dan E. Barker, E for Edwin, although I like to think the E is for evidence. And my son, Dan Barker, Dan T. Barker, T for Timothy, but I think the T is for either a cross, right? Or the T's for truth. Let's say it's for truth. So Daniel for truth and Daniel for evidence. And I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I'm in my office here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation national headquarters. I had to close the blinds so the light wouldn't be so, backlit for this thing. And yeah, that is an old Mac SE computer up there. That's the first computer that we owned, that we published our newspaper on back in 1990, 1991. It had I think it had 40 megs of memory in it. It was really huge at the time. Cost $1,000. And yeah, there's a little devil up there. Hold on. My little mascot here. There's a little guy who's looking over, making sure I'm doing evil things here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So you can sit here and just watch it while we're doing this here. And there's a chess set. You see the chess set? It's the Indians and the Indians and the soldiers, right? So I like to put the Indians. The Indians are playing on the white chess set, and then the soldiers are playing the black. They're the bad guys, right? Because our tribe is Native American. And the rook for the soldiers is an outhouse, appropriately. So here's my office, and Danny said, I could talk about whatever I wanted to, and I said, "How much time can I talk?" And he said, "Well, 10 minutes to 30 minutes," and that's a big mistake. I used to be a preacher, and you should never tell a preacher that he can talk as long as he wants, because like I like to say in some of my talks, the word reverend. The word reverend is a typo. The first letter used to be an N. You'll get it tomorrow. You'll laugh about it tomorrow. So anyway, I used to be a preacher, and I was an evangelical. I was a Bible believer. I was a cross-country evangelist. I was a missionary to Mexico. I was a Christian songwriter for many years, and I'm still getting royalties from some of my Christian music. In fact, hold on here. Here's a octavo from Vacation Bible School. It's called Sunlight Mountain. See, sun, S-O-N, Sunlight Mountain. Jesus shows. And so I wrote the 3 songs for these things for years. This was back in the early 80s. And back in the 70s, I wrote some music. Back before Danny was born, actually. My first big hit in the Christian community was this one called Mary Had a Little Lamb. And no, I didn't write the original Mary Had a Little Lamb, but sometimes people think I did. But anyway, Mary Had a Little Lamb. It's the Christmas story from the eyes of the animals. See the animals at the manger? Kind of hard to see with the glare. But anyway, this was published by Manna Music and or Manna Records. And then I had a follow-up called for Easter called His Fleece Was White as Snow. And that was, they both became kind of big sellers back in the 70s. And I'm still getting royalties. Even today, I'm still getting royalties from some of this music. But now I'm writing free thought books. Some of you might have seen my book for children called Maybe Yes, Maybe No. And the lead character in here is Andrea, and she's a skeptic. And they're investigating a haunted house story. And I named her Andrea because my daughter Andrea, who's one of Danny's older sisters, she was always going through life going, I'm sure, show me the evidence, right? So anyway, Maybe Yes, Maybe No is a guide for young skeptics about the scientific method, basically. And this is Prometheus books. And then I followed that up with one about morality called Maybe Right, Maybe Wrong, a guide for young thinkers. And how do you make moral decisions? And they're kind of simple. They're kind of aimed at early teen, maybe 11, 12, 13, 14 8-year-old. But I've had high schoolers and college students say they learned something from this. So basically, if you can boil concepts down into a simple format. So, and then some of you may have read my book, Losing Faith in Faith, or the book that tells my whole story about being a preacher called Godless, how an evangelical preacher became one of America's leading atheists. Do I have one in here? I probably have a copy somewhere. Anyway, Godless tells my story. And in that book, Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword, and he said, Dan wasn't just a preacher. He was the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. And I was the guy out there, winning souls for Jesus and converting the world. But then a book I wrote last year about, you hear people say, without God, there's no meaning in life. Forget the evidence, forget the arguments, forget that it doesn't make any sense. If you don't have God, your life is meaningless and empty. And you hear that from a lot of Christian apologists and theologians and preachers and all that. So, and especially, Rick Warren, the famous megachurch pastor in California, Saddleback Church. Rick Warren wrote his big blockbuster that's still selling millions of copies called The Purpose-Driven Life. Why are you on this planet? And the very first sentence of his book is, it's not about you. God planned your life, and he has a plan for you. So I wrote a book challenging the purpose-driven life, and I turned it upside down to make life-driven purpose. And how does an atheist find meaning? And basically what I say in this book is that there is no purpose of life, and that's good. If there were a purpose of life, if it was top-down, purpose-driven life, then we would be secondary. We would be slaves. We would be like servants or members of some cosmic army that we had to march to, The fact that there is no purpose of life makes life much more meaningful, much more enjoyable, much more purposeful. But to say that there's no purpose of life is not to say that there's no purpose in life. And we are biological organisms in a natural environment, and there's problems to solve. We have challenges to meet. It can be the basic stuff like food and water and shelter and disease and the elements, or it can be inequality or war or oppression, whatever. There's dozens of different types of problems that confront us in our lives. And who would dare say that someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not have purpose in her life? She was fighting for a half century for this crazy idea that women should be able to participate in their own democracy. And she and her friend Susan B. Anthony, who was an agnostic, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an atheist. And she was very outspoken against the Bible. And Susan B. Anthony she was a little nervous about criticizing the Bible and religion so much. But she said, I'm glad to see you do it, Elizabeth, because, the church was the big problem and the Bible was the big problem in the way of women's equality. So atheists and agnostics have led lives of immense purpose and immense meaning, not top down, not purpose-driven life, but bottom up, a life-driven purpose. So that's what this book's all about. But my most exciting book, obviously, for an author, the most exciting one is the one that you just wrote. And in fact, Dan T helped me with the book. And in the back of it, in the credits, you'll see here, let me find it here under the acknowledgments, that I especially want to thank my son, Dan T. Barker, for tediously checking every single biblical reference in this book, a true labor of love. The book is called God. Do I look like an infomercial? I need to hold this just exactly right. Wait a minute. Get the camera just right. God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. That probably doesn't quite cut it for infomercial quality, but at least there it is. And so this book was actually an accident. I didn't think I was going to write this book, but it was Richard Dawkins, and you see that Richard Dawkins wrote the forward by Richard Dawkins. In early 2014, in April, Richard Dawkins emailed me, and he said that he was working on a Keynote slide. Keynote, most of you know Keynote is the Mac version of PowerPoint. So he's working on it, and he uses Macs, and I use Macs, so right there. The difference between Macs and PCs, I think, is like Catholics and Protestants, They can't both be true. They're not that compatible. Maybe there's a little bit when they are strange bedfellows on a certain social issue. But anyway, Dawkins was using Keynote, and because in his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins has a sentence. And he's in The God Delusion. If you read The God Delusion, I'm sure all of you have. The atheists of Facebook. I said faitheists. Maybe that's a good word. Atheists of Facebook. You've probably all read The God Delusion, and it's a passionate book. It's a strong argument book, but it doesn't deserve what people have called it. They've called it strident and angry and combative and all of that. If you read it, it's just pretty much basic reasoning and common sense. And so, but even Richard Dawkins admits there's one sentence in that book that really has raised hackles, I guess. It's the first sentence of chapter 2 of The God Delusion, where he said, in fact, by the way, I'm going to show you this. This is cool. I have it up here on my shelf. Before The God Delusion was printed as a book back in 2006, Richard Dawkins and Annie Laurie and I were in Reykjavik for a humanist conference, and we had heard that he was working on this new book called The God Delusion. We'd heard about it. We thought, this is going to be a great new book. It wasn't out yet, but when we were at this conference in Iceland, Richard said, hey, I have one extra copy of the manuscript that I'm sending to the publisher, and would you like it? So he handed us this. This is not the published book of The God Delusion. This is just the manuscript copy with notes on it and, that kind of stuff that he sent. He had one extra copy, and he said, would you like it? And we said, would we? So, and we didn't know at the time it was going to be this big, huge, big seller. We thought it was going to be a good book, obviously. But he inscribed a little thing here to Dan and Annie Laurie, all best wishes. So on the plane coming back from Reykjavik, I got to read The God Delusion before it was published, and it was pretty cool. It's like seeing a sneak preview of a movie before it comes out. We didn't realize it would be such a blockbuster, such a huge, monstrous bestseller all over the world. But in chapter 2, the very first sentence of chapter 2, and I think I can quote it from memory now. I've been thinking about this for so long. The sentence starts, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, vindictive, unforgiving control freak, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Maybe I missed one or two in there. But anyway, there's these 19 adjectives or 19 characteristics that Dawkins has in that sentence in The God Delusion. He says that one sentence has garnered him more criticism than anything else he's ever written in his life. And people have lambasting him for that. What does the scientist know about the Bible? What does a biologist understand about properly interpreting the Word of God? Who does Richard Dawkins think he is to make such a moral criticism of this God? Well, actually, Richard Dawkins just read the Bible. He's actually opened it and read it. And so he was trying to defend himself. The chief rabbi of England, or maybe of London, the chief rabbi called that sentence anti-Semitic. But then later on reflection, he apologized. The rabbi said, well, but maybe it's not really anti-Semitic. But he still didn't like it because you're criticizing this God of the Bible. So Richard was working on this keynote slide, and he emailed me and he said, can you help me gather Bible verses so that I can illustrate it? And he wanted to have like the first part of the sentence would be this body of the spider, and then 19 legs would go out of the spider on the keynote slide. And then you could click, for example, on ethnic cleansing, and up pops the verse from the Bible, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. And so we were doing this, we were working on this list, and I was emailing back and forth, and then in July, he sent an email back to me, and he said, there's so many verses here. We had more than 1,500 verses gathered to illustrate these 19 characteristics. And he said, you know what? And this was his idea, not mine. He said, you know what? This would make a good book. Pun intended. It's a good book. And he said, make a book called The Most Unpleasant Character, and each chapter would be one of those characteristics. So when we were in the Birmingham airport, when I read that on July 4th that year, and Annie Laurie was reading that too, and she said, hell yes, that would be a great book. So I dug in, and for 16 months, it took 16 months of getting up early in the morning to study and research and organize and all that. And Richard was looking at it also, giving advice. In fact, Richard Dawkins was cautioning me some places to kind of soften the language a little bit, so that it wouldn't be so strident, just let the facts speak for themselves. So God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction, is what came out of that. So what I did was, instead of just having a list, you can see in here there's all these long lists of, for example, under pestilential, here's a list, here's a verse, here's a verse, here's another verse. Instead of having just a long list of verses, which would be kind of boring, because who wants to read the Old Testament? I started each chapter with a narrative description of one or two of those characteristics from stories that are in the Bible. And I think what happens is that most people, they have the Bible at home. The Bible's in the hotel room, the Gideons put it in there. And presidents put their hand on it when they swear to uphold the Constitution. Then, that's my phone ringing. I'll have to call back later. So what happens is, I don't think people read it. If they did read it, they would turn into atheists, like Isaac Asimov said. He thinks properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived. And A. Milne, who's the author of Winnie the Pooh, for example, who was a non-believer, he said he thinks the Bible is responsible for more atheists than any other literature ever written. And some of you, 4% of our organization, says the Bible is the main reason that they became atheists or non-believers. So I think what most people do with the Bible, most believers, they don't read it. It's kind of like when you're installing a new app on your device, and the terms and conditions. Oh, the terms and conditions. You just scroll down to the bottom and you hit accept, and you don't even read them. Who wants to read that stuff? I mean, really, who wants to read the Bible? And I've got up here, like, I don't know, how many copies of the Bible do I have here? I have this Dakes version. This is not Dakes. I have this Dixon version of the Bible, which I use a lot, and a number of other translations. But reading the Bible can be boring and laborious, and so I decided, well, let's just tell a couple of the stories. And I was shocked. I was really surprised at some of the stories that I thought, that I should have known, but didn't know. I didn't remember that I knew. For example, God threatening to sexually molest the Israelite women in Jeremiah 13. God taking credit and bragging about destroying a loving family for no reason, just to do it, The story of Samson's wedding. I don't know if I remember the story of Samson's wedding when I was a preacher. I never preached about it, but, Samson was this like Hercules character. And just like Hercules, Samson had like a divine birth, which means he was going to be special. So Samson's parents knew he was going to be special. When Samson got old enough to start looking at girls, he saw a woman that he wanted to marry. And she was a Philistine, which were the hated enemies. And so God said, I have a way. I have a pretext here. I'm going to kill some of the hated, dreaded Philistines. And here's how I'm going to do it. And it's from the very beginning. This whole story is a pretext, he calls it. It's like an excuse to kill Philistines. So Samson falls in love with this Philistine woman over on the coast, further west. And the parents are shocked. Why do you want to marry a Philistine woman? Why don't you pick one of your own Israelites? These are the enemies. And Samson said, get her for me. So, women were property, so the parents had to buy the woman. So they said, well, okay. They thought this was kind of weird. They thought their son was making a rash choice. So Samson's walking over to her city, and as he's walking there, he sees this lion. This lion comes out, and so Samson just grabs the lion and kills it single-handedly, all by himself. Except nobody sees it. It just happens, and nobody sees it. And so then he goes to meet the family, and then he comes back, and then they're coming back for the wedding. Samson sees the dead lion on the ground, all decomposing, and in the body of the lion, there's a honeycomb, and there's these bees. And he goes, So what does anybody do when you see that? He sticks his hand in the honeycomb, and he grabs it and goes, that's good. So he brings a bunch of it back to the wedding, and there's these 40, is it 30 or 40? There's these 40 Philistine attendants. Remember, they're enemies, but they're having this marriage. I guess it's intertribal or interracial marriage they're having. And so God set up this lion in the honeycombs so that Samson could have a riddle to bet these Philistines. And God wanted Samson to lose the bet. This is weird. So Samson goes to these Philistine men and he says, I have a riddle for you, and if I win, you each have to give me one of your expensive garments. And if you can solve the riddle, I'll give each of you an expensive garment. They couldn't pass it up. These 40 guys had a week, because it was a week-long deal to think about it. So the riddle was basically, out of the strong comes something sweet, I forget the exact riddle. But anyway, they couldn't figure it out. They were thinking for days and days, what's the riddle? What's the riddle? What's the riddle? And so they went to his wife and they said, tell us the riddle. And she said, he never told me it. He didn't know. I don't know the answer. He didn't tell anybody about the lion and the bees. And she pestered him and she nagged him. And finally, on the last day, at the last minute, Samson finally tells his wife, his new wife. She's nameless, by the way. He tells his new wife, and supposedly God cares so much about holy matrimony, right? Here was a wedding ordained by God. And so she goes to these Philistine men who said, if you don't tell us, we're going to burn your house down and kill your father. So she had no choice. She told them the answer to the riddle. And just before the end of the feast, they came up to Samson and said, we have the answer. What is stronger than a lion, and what is sweeter than honey? Well, then Samson got mad because he knew he was tricked. He knew, And so then, here's the whole thing. This is all what God's trying to do, this loving God of the Bible. The Spirit of God came upon Samson. He was so angry because he lost the bet. The Spirit of God came on him, and he rushed over to this other city, and he killed 40 Philistine men, and he took their garments off of them, and he brought them back so he could pay off his gambling debt. That's how God decided to kill 40 people. Why didn't he just give them heart attacks or something? But anyway, it's a crazy story. You wouldn't believe it if it was in a dark action comic book or something. But and by the way, the story ends with Samson saying he didn't want his wife anymore. So he gave his wife to his best man. She was just a disposable property. And the chapter in my new book on misogyny shows how cheap women's lives are viewed in the entire Old Testament. So Richard Dawkins and I are asking people, we are begging people, here we are, two leading atheists in the world. We are asking people, please read the Bible. How can we be faulted for that? So read the Bible for yourself, make up your own mind. You don't need experts. You don't have to be an expert to realize that even the experts disagree. How much time do I have left here? I better quit here. 24 minutes. Anyway, read the Bible. Look at some of these illustrations by Gustave Doré about some of the horrible scenes. And by the way, this is not a cheap shot. This French artist from the 19th century illustrated Shakespeare and Dante's Inferno, and he illustrated the Bible. These pictures appear in a lot of Christian Bibles. Here's the story of the bears that came out of the forest to kill 42 children. Why did these children have to be killed? Because they were mocking the bald head of a priest. Right. They mocked the bald head of a priest, and so God sent these bears out of the forest to kill. And not the priest, the prophet. I'm sorry, that's the prophet. Is that Elisha? And then the bears come out to kill these 42 kids. I'm sure 42 kids couldn't run away from a bear, but anyway, that's what the story says. So there's a lot in here, and there's a lot more ghastliness and horrible, pestilence, and in fact, part one of the book is called Dawkins Was Right, and I have those 19 chapters in part one of the book. But as I was going through it, I found a whole bunch of more. I found 8 more characteristics that Dawkins overlooked, or maybe he didn't overlook them. He just thought 19 was enough. So I have a part 2 of the book that's called Dawkins Was Too Kind. So, and that has pyromaniacal, it has angry, it has merciless, curse hurling, aborticidal, cannibalistic, slave monger. And then the final chapter of the book, In God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction, is what about Jesus? Because obviously Christians are going to say you shouldn't judge the Bible by the Old Testament alone. You should look at the whole picture. So let's do that. Let's see if Jesus was any better than his dad. It turns out Jesus was not a chip off the old block. He was the old block itself. He even said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He called himself I am. So all of those adjectives that apply to the Old Testament God apply equally well to the New Testament Jesus, if you believe Jesus was telling the truth when he said, I and the Father are one. So I'm going to stop now because I ran out of things to say because we got some meetings downstairs. But anyway, thanks for watching and thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your convention. And I'm just going to end here very inelegantly by hitting this button here that says stop recording. Bye.